Hello and welcome to Oxford Interfaith Forum. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Zeynep Sayıgan with her team in the Institute for Islamic, Christian and Jewish Studies. And we very much hope it is the beginning of the collaboration. So I'm delighted now to hand over to the moderator of the session, Dr. Alicia Wimbush, who will introduce our members of the panel and will moderate the section. Thank you very much. And Professor Wimbush, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Dr. Taya, thank you for this opportunity to partner with you during such an important time, World Interfaith Harmony Week. Again, my name is Dr. Alicia Wimbush. I serve as the Program Director for Religious Leaders at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. ICJS is so delighted to collaborate with the Oxford Interfaith Forum to bring you this session, Death and Dying in Interfaith Contexts. So today we have with us several scholars and spiritual care practitioners who participated in a faculty seminar this past summer at ICJS to explore interreligious perspectives on death and dying. And so I am grateful to be in conversation with them again for this session and for you all joining us. And so I would like to just do some very brief introductions for each of them. So first, I want to start with my colleague, Dr. Zeynep Sayıgan. She is the Muslim scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies and an affiliated faculty at Virginia Theological Seminary. In 2019, Sayıgan was awarded the first book grant for scholars of color by the Louisville Institute, and she is the host of the podcast On Being Muslim. I encourage you to check her out on that podcast. It's wonderful. And then we have Tahira Wellman. She is an advanced practicing inpatient internal medicine PA at Montefiore Medical Center with 17 years of experience in the fields of internal medicine, cardiology, medical oncology, and clinical research. She is currently completing a second master's degree in Islamic religious leadership and Islamic studies from Boston Islamic Seminary. She has received a full scholarship as a Muslim American Society Fellow. Tahira, is so glad to have you with us today. And then I want to introduce Revd Dr Jamie Eaddy. She is a thanatologist, a public theologian, and founder of Thoughtful Transitions. She specializes in grief support, trauma-informed care, and death doula services, and she works within communities impacted by violence. Dr. Eaddy, we're glad that you're here with us today. Next, we have Dr. Richard E. McCarron, who teaches liturgical and sacramental theology, ritual studies, liturgy and culture, and catechesis at Catholic Theological Union. His research areas are liturgy and sacrament in the context of postmodernities, hermeneutics and liturgy, and liturgical enculturation and post-colonial studies. Dr. McCarron, we are glad that you're here with us today. And then we also have Dr. Ellen Postman, who holds chair at the Department of Baldwin Wallace University, where she teaches comparative religions with specializations in Buddhism and Judaism. Dr. Postman, we're so glad you're here with us. So I would love to start off. As I said, ICJS hosted a faculty seminar this past summer, specifically bringing together scholars and spiritual care providers to really delve into this topic of interreligious perspectives on death and dying. And so Dr. Zeynep Sayıgan was my wonderful co-facilitator for that faculty seminar. And I would just love for her to share why this topic was so important for both scholars and spiritual care practitioners to come together and talk about this topic that we often want to avoid, but we can't avoid the topic of death and dying, especially why is it important in this particular time that we're living in. So Dr. Sayıgan, I invite you to share.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you, Dr. Taya, and to the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Like Alicia said, we are so grateful for this opportunity to share some of our work that we had at the faculty seminar and at the Institute with our dear colleagues. And I'm grateful for the guests here for your time and allowing us to share a little bit of that. So I remember when we were all going through the pandemic a few years ago, I turned to Alicia and said, so many people are dying, so many people are grieving, but we don't really have spaces where we can talk about this. Everybody is so isolated, everybody is lonely and trying to cope on their own. And so that was a very early conversation, I remember, and having with Alicia, and said, we need to do something. We need to offer something, some courses. I'm really passionate about anything, spirituality wise and theology. But then fast forward 2 years ago, when my own little daughter died tragically in an accident. I was very fortunate to be surrounded by wonderful colleagues who said, after I came back, how can we support you if you want to offer and process your pain in your work, through your research, through some type of courses, we are here to support you. And I felt very blessed for that opportunity. And it was that year I had the chance to co-organize this faculty seminar with Alicia. And I thought, this is too gigantic. I can't carry and process this on my own. And I know so many people are dealing with grief and experiencing death. And why don't I just do this as a scholar with other dear colleagues? And while I have this privileged space, to think and process theologies of death, death rituals, anything that is related to that. And so I've reached out to these wonderful colleagues. And so for me, it was very much of my work is autobiographical, but also it was a deep act of embodied pedagogy, that I brought my own self to this work, trying to cope and process my own pain, but also learning and growing and trying to learn from others who are going through a similar experience, like Alicia said, we can't avoid. So that is how the faculty seminar emerged. And my own takeaway is, and I hope that people here will be inspired, that as frightening as death is, as horrible as these experiences are, there's also some, like I said earlier with Alan, when we had that conversation, there's always a life-giving element into it, a reawakening, a revival, a new growth, a new birth of new ideas, and a new rediscovery, I found personally. So I wanted to have this chance to with my scholars, with my colleagues, to make that a wider conversation where we all grow together collectively and think together.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for sharing your personal experience and bringing us together, because you're right, we don't necessarily have the spaces to think together with other colleagues about what we all are going to face. And so thank you again for opening up your heart and sharing this space with us. So we're going to start off. I would love for each of the panelists to do some of that personal sharing and talk about what is your understanding of death and how is it actually informed by your spiritual or religious framework. And anybody can jump in there.
Sure. Good morning or afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. Before I answer the question, I just want to pause for a moment. I live on the East Coast in Philadelphia, and I have several friends and colleagues who are 2 hours down the road from me, and they are holding the names of the 67 who took their last breaths yesterday as the helicopter and the American Airlines flight collided. So I just want to pause as we talk about death and dying and grief and bereavement, and just acknowledge the very real circumstances that many of us are navigating in this world. And so with that, okay, thank you. So death, right? I said this last breath that is unavoidable. So it's this unavoidable, inevitable experience that everyone who takes a first breath will also experience in their life. But for me and for many others, I'm sure, it's not just this last breath where you are no longer in this body on this earth. That for some, including myself, it's seen as this threshold, this transition into the next, whatever the next is for some, right? And so death, this transition that is individual, but perhaps also communal, whereby the person who has taken their last breath still holds great significance, of course, in our hearts, but for many, is still present, right? It's still present in the rituals that we engage. It's still present in how we might engage ancestry work that we believe. Even now, I believe my grandmother is still guiding me and directing me. And there are moments when I wake up in the middle of the night wanting to prepare a certain meal. And I know the only person who would want me to make collard greens and cornbread and some of the rich foods, right, that she made was my grandmother. And so when I have those moments, right, I get up and do that. So death, right? Death, the person is separated. They are no longer with me physically, but there is still this deep connection that we get to engage. In my faith tradition, I'm an ordained Baptist minister who leans into African traditional religions and really just sort of openness to how I believe the universe might speak and guide me. So my faith and my understanding of death is also greatly informed by that. And so death is also the precursor to resurrection, right? That there is no getting up, there is no becoming new, that death is how we move toward that. I think the challenge is, and then I know our time, I'll pass to my colleagues. I think one of the challenges is that there are many who we believe die before their time, as I just named the 67, where this helicopter and plane have collided, right? So while death is this inevitable part of life cycle, it is also one that we sometimes meet with great pain and great anxiety and a great deal of grief, and some systematic and systemic injustices, right? That there is this way that death, although a natural occurrence in our lives, can also be fraught with a kind of pain that is not easily quenched by our faith traditions. And so I'll start there and let my colleagues sort of add on to where they are in death.
Thank you, Jamie. Richard, you can go ahead.
Sure. Perhaps, so speaking from a Roman Catholic perspective myself, I think I want to echo a lot of the language that Dr. Jamie has used around death as separation and that taking of the last breath. And I think as I think about the way that I understand death, both in terms of that physical, biological level, and maybe even our philosophically trying to delve into that for myself in terms of phenomenology of finitude, of who we are as human beings, that certain condition of our dying. But it's ultimately in the perspective of faith that I've been able to interpret death in a way that that is enabled to help that to become more meaningful to me and to help others in that time of struggle with the anxiety and with the that acceptance of death. One of the things that I lean into in the tradition are the ways that the poetry of our prayers and the movements of our bodies in ritualizing have helped us to interpret and to understand death. And so it's helped me to understand death, not so much as that final moment, that leaving last, but of transition and of passage. The way that the bonds of kinship that Dr. Jamie had spoken about are rewoven and cast in new ways, that the pain of separation is met by a reintegration of our identities in new ways, and our ways of relating to the world have changed. In the Roman tradition, there's a prayer. It speaks about the certain condition of our dying that makes us sad. And so that sense of of loss that we feel, both a personal loss, the end of our personal stories, and those stories of those around us, but that is brightened by the great promise of resurrection, and that shines forth that we know that life is changed, not ended, the expression in Latin, vita mutator non tolitor, that comes from the passions of the martyrs who experienced this death in violent ways. And I lean into also a prayer from the Byzantine tradition that speaks of the God of spirits and flesh who has trampled down death, so that this power of death has been transformed by the resurrection and of Christ, and that Christ is the life and repose of those of us who have fallen asleep, and that it is not just this, that there's a great hope of resurrection that does dawn upon us. So I think that this interweaving for me of both of the personal experience, but also of looking to the way that tradition has provided a poetry, a language, to help to give meaning to these moments that can often seem meaningless, that can often seem random, and can seem so tragic to us. And to help us to integrate that into a memory, and to integrate that into a living and a communion of the living and the dead together.
Beautiful, Richard. And thank you for lifting up how sometimes we need poetry and music to help us make meaning of these transitions. So thank you for sharing the liturgies. Tahira, Zainab, and then Ellen, I'll have you close out on this question.
Thank you. So when I think of death, I think of it from two perspectives. The first perspective is as a medical practitioner. So I think of the science aspect of how death is defined, which is an end of life, an end of signs of life, vital signs having come to an end. But then I also think of spiritual death. And so this is how my understanding of death is informed by my spiritual beliefs. In a prior engagement, I spoke about how there's the seen world and the unseen world in the Islamic paradigm as we understand it. So in the seen world, if we were to look at the calculus of death, again, you look for those signs of the absence of life. However, there's an unseen world, which is the spiritual world that we believe is very much coexisting alongside what our senses can see. And so when I think of death, I also think of spiritual death. And so that can be defined, and that is very layered. So for a Muslim, to be alive spiritually is to be connected to one's Lord, to have an awareness of the Creator, to have an awareness of one's purpose in life. And for us, spiritual death could be a disconnect from that. So in the Muslim paradigm, there's many understandings about death. There's the spiritual unseen realm and how that affects the connection of the soul of the human being to its creator, or not connect that relationship. And then there's also the corporeal understanding of death, which is, I guess, more of a scientific view. So that can be very layered, but I'll end there for now.
Thank you, Tahira. Zainab, you want to weigh in?
Perhaps just to add on that, death is very much seen as a creative act of God and by the divine. So Muslim theology very much wants to emphasize that death is not random or an accident. As chaotic and ugly and frightening and horrific those deaths might look like, there is, like Tahira said, an unseen element, dimension that we do not perceive, which is always beautiful, has meaning and purpose and wisdom to offer. And I think that is also, of course, the fundamental challenge to we living in this fine-tuned universe where we witness that everything is embedded in deep rationality. So this idea that death, or the death of the highest level of life, human life, is just a random occurrence, an accident, a coincidence, just is not embraced from that perspective. So I want to just drive home that Islamic theology of death very much talks about that death and life were both created by God. Mortality is divinely willed, and is something that the tradition wants people to remember frequently, that it's part of the spiritual DNA of a Muslim, to practice memento mori, which has been a very widely practiced, but then in a modern culture, we somehow, took a step back. So it's really important to see that life-giving element of death, that death invites us to live more meaningful lives, more lives that have quality, just because of the fact that we realize that this could be literally our last moment. We make sure that our priorities are clear. What are our important values? It gives us a sharper vision. It enhances the quality of life by being fully immersed in the reality of being us as mortals. So that's why Islam really wants Muslims to remember death frequently, not in a way to paralyze them, but to understand that life is so precious, and to make sure that we make our decisions consciously, because we know this could be our last moment.
Thank you, Zainab, and everyone. Those are perfect segues to, I will also, talk a little bit about memento mori and the ways in which what all of you are saying about the last moments being so precious and giving some clarity, not just to a transition, but to what it means for how we live our lives, right? I've been teaching a class on death and the afterlife in world religions at my school for like 20 years. And I just have to start by saying that I have no idea what happens when we die, right? So I don't even think about that much, even though I teach about it all the time, right? So I don't pretend to know what happens when we die. I have studied too many perspectives for too long to determine which might be true and which might not be true. But from a personal perspective, I was raised Jewish, and I was taught in my particular Jewish context that there was no hell, and even heaven wasn't emphasized much. The emphasis was always on this life and making the most of this life. And then, having studied and practiced Buddhism for 30 years or so, I've been inspired by the idea that we are born and die in every moment. And it's a little bit similar to some things Jamie was saying earlier, like every moment is a moment where we die. And then a new one of us is born with all new possibilities every moment. And the moment of death in Buddhism, while more intense, is just another moment in that cycle. That said, Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism in particular, there's some Tibetan Buddhist prayer flags behind me in the background, teaches that death is an opportunity, sort of like the way that Zainab was discussing. It is a challenge, and that our thoughts at that moment matter, right? I think Richard talked about this too. Our moments at death matter. And this is true in many religious traditions who see that last moment as a chance for a profession of faith, for example. I know I hope to be calm and present at my death, as many Buddhists do. So if I have some understanding of death, it's that I hope to be calm and present at my own death. But turning back to life, Buddhism has many meditations on death that affect how we lead life. Meditating on death, meditating on corpses in ancient Buddhism was designed to help people see impermanence in life and to let go of attachments, right? So there was a function in terms of how thinking about death and facing death was supposed to help us lead our lives. I personally, for those of you who are scholars out there, am a huge fan of Max Muller's quote that he who knows one religion knows no religion, and that the idea of examining others' religions helps us to understand our own. And so when I think about that Buddhist practice of facing death, when I think about what Zainab just said about how important it is in the Muslim tradition to think about death in order to live life, I come back to my Jewish practice, and I've taken very seriously the idea of Yom Kippur as a practice for death. So many people know that Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year in Jewish tradition. Many people know it's a day of fasting, but not as many people, including not as many Jewish people, understand the symbolism of the holiday as practicing for one's death as an intense way to reorient our lives and priorities accordingly in life. So for me, when I think about death, I think about what does it mean? What does it teach me? What does my death teach me about how to live my life?
Oh, thank you so much, Ellen. And thank you all just for, I see these themes of, the little deaths that we die before our final death, and just the different transitions that we go through that feel like a dying. And so, Jamie, you were mentioning about untimely deaths, deaths caused by violence. And oftentimes it's hard to face those types of deaths. And so I would love for you to speak about, first of all, how can we grieve these types of deaths? Sometimes mass violence that's taking place that cause death. What spaces can be created to grieve those deaths? And then for those who might be spiritual care providers, and you see how sometimes death is caused by systems, oppressive systems, what could spiritual care providers do to begin to confront those systems? Because we know how to care for people during those times, but how do we actually confront those systems?
That's such a hard, that's such a hard question. First, let's start with, if I can deposit a sort of description of grief in our space that I use, right? So grief, this sort of natural response to death, or to loss, change, transition, to unmet expectations or unrealized dreams, right? This change, this loss that when we have faith, hope, trust, have some attachment toward something, and that is in some way severed, right? This feeling of grief. When you talk about around violence and untimely, and I use the term untimely because that's what it feels like. The work that I do here in the city of Philadelphia, I am also the director of counseling for an organization called the Anti-Violence Partnership of Philadelphia, where we provide support to co-survivors, what we call them, co-survivors of homicide and survivors of other crimes, right? So I am in when violence occurs, we are here with community providing various kinds of support for them. So part of what I do specifically as death doula, who is in this role, death doula and chaplain in this role, is often those deaths that are related to death dealing systems or violence or injustice. We wish for those voices to be silenced. And so part of allowing people space to grieve is opening space for them to get the cry out of their throat, right? Because far too often the request from death dealing systems is that you swallow your voice, right? And so what we do is we open space for people to name, right? To get the cry out, if their voice is shaking, if the tear, whatever, to get the cry out of their throat and to name the source of the pain. And often we find that in those places, even in Philadelphia, where around the early days of COVID, early days of the pandemic, the homicide rate was over 500. That means that, and that doesn't mean people who have been injured in violence. That is homicide rate over 500. It has decreased by over 30% in 2024. So there is some healing work being done, but it is being able to name that the violence, that the death has occurred, and being able to trace it back to systems that are oppressive. Because sometimes we look at these individual deaths and opportunities as it is this person on this street who did it to that person on that street. And we have to be able to trace it back a bit further to see that this may be something systemic that we need to explore. So as caregivers, as practitioners, as chaplains, as pastors, and whatever roles and titles we hold, how are we allowing people to name the pain often caused by injustice that they are experiencing in their own lives? Are we able to socially locate ourselves and name the privilege that we have so that the other person's pain doesn't seem like, oh, I can't possibly believe that this would happen? If I might name it, we go back to 2020, there were a lot of people who just couldn't believe that someone would put their foot and knee on someone's neck until they breathe their last breath. There are communities that see that kind of violence regularly. So we have to begin to engage with people who don't look like us, people whose experiences may not be like us, and believe the stories of folks who have been marginalized. So that is one of the ways that we do that, right? And then secondly is be willing to, in order to be willing to confront these systems, we have to do a serious work of self-awareness to see how we contribute to systems that may cause premature deaths, right? So I worked in the NICU as a chaplain, and there were ways that I saw Black women and brown women and Indigenous women who were dealing with maternal mortality. And this was, some of this was preventable. And so am I willing to see the injustice and to recognize that in order for change to occur, that there may be the need for me to die, hear me, not in my last breath, but die as in some of the identities that I have claimed as my own that do harm to others, that those identities may need to die so that I can be born again in a new fashion, in a way that is more compassionate, right? So this is the work that looking at mass violence, looking at communities that are experiencing genocide, and we can name these communities. It is, am I willing to allow myself to die in order for others to live? And that is, when I look at my faith tradition, that is what the revolutionary radical Palestinian Jesus did, was died, right, at the hands of empire so that others might live. And so that is one of the ways that I think we confront and shift systems so that other people, are we willing to die? Am I willing to die so that someone else might eat? Am I willing to die so that someone who is unhoused, and I'm saying someone, but there are hundreds and thousands and millions of someones, am I willing to die so that you might live? And as people of faith, and I'm saying across tradition, I'd even go to our humanist siblings, as people, as humanity, if we are unable to look at one another and say, if I'm unable to die so that others might live, then that's the kind of internal work that we need to do if we're going to confront these death-dealing systems.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I feel like we could do a whole seminar on that alone. And I thank you for just kind of even broadening, all of you have really broadened our understanding of what it means to die, what death looks like you said, dying to some of our own identities that perpetuate and continue these systems of oppression. So thank you for just even broadening our understanding even more. I would love to go to you, Richard. You have done research on rituals, and as we are facing death, whether it is on a mass scale, whether it's personally, we all need some type of rituals to make meaning of these times. And so as you've done research on rituals across cultures, have you found there are common themes or patterns, specifically at the end of life, that help both the dying and those who are navigating the dying process, who are walking with the person who's dying? Can you lift up some of those rituals for us?
I think, Alicia, that's one of the things to say, that it's not just for the dying person themselves, but the community with them. And I think one of the things that I've seen in the development of Christian tradition in particular is the sense that no one is allowed to die alone. And so the fact that monastic communities created great moments of ritualizing around and in anticipation of death, and allowing we've been talking about, that being able to give voice to this, that the rituals turn to the poetry of the Psalms or to the words of Scripture, to be able to allow those voices from the tradition to be put onto the lips of the dying or onto the lips of the community, to give that sense of understanding that transition, that transitus that we're happening, so that as a person comes into life in a loved community, so that person is able to go forth from the community in a community of loved. And then the way that ritual enables us to reestablish these relationships that are changed, not ended, at least in the Christian perspective, right, is that these rituals enable us then help us, the dying person, to be able to negotiate that transition, but also to help us who remain and who are to give voice to our grief, to give voice to our lament, to allow that pain of the passing, but also to do that in hope. And so the way that Alleluia can be sung in the midst of tears is a way of practicing us to experience that in every moment of our living there is a dying, and that it is into hope, into eternal life. And that the rituals that we also have seen and perhaps that have died out are those of helping us to negotiate mourning. Periods of mourning and of keeping the name of that person and the memory of that person, and that importance of may your memory be eternal, becomes a theme in which, through these patterns of both immediate rites, but then these extended rites that we have across the traditions. So the sense of allowing a release of that person from our care and affection, to entrust them to the care and affection of God, and then an integrating of them, no longer present among us bodily, but present among us in a way in which there's in the spirit of those are that we're bound into communion. So I think that these moments of transition, these moments of pattern, that in the moment of what can be experienced as senselessness, the tradition provides to give us something of hope. In these moments of pain, the tradition allows us to be able to express that. Dr. Jamie, as you said, to allow that cry to come forth from the throat, and for us to show our care and affection of the body and the movement of that, and to the body to its final disposition, however that may be negotiated by a tradition. So these ritual patterns that help us and shape us. And then I think the other aspect of ritual that we've been lifting up in this is that there's an ethical dimension, which then allows us to be able to say that who are we in our care and concern for one another in these moments of death, then extend to those moments of those who aren't able to be accompanied. The tradition of confraternities that have come together to make sure that no one would have to be buried in an unmarked grave, that their names are kept and preserved, and that their memory is carried on. So I think there's something in these patterns that help us in these negotiations, that help us in our social obligations, and that also help us in terms of this reintegration of who our beloved dead are, and how we as communities of memory can continue forward.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard, for that. I would love to hear her to share from her experience. She is in the medical field, and so she is understanding death, like she said, from a scientific perspective, but also a spiritual perspective. And I would love to hear from you, Tahira. How do you think medical teams can work alongside chaplains, or what can medical teams learn from chaplains? And what can chaplains learn from medical teams as they are ministering and caring for those at the end of life?
I believe she dropped.
Did she? Okay. Sorry, I'm just seeing that she dropped. Thank you, Jamie. All right. So when she comes back on, we'll have her share on that. So I'll go to Ellen, and to a topic that I'm very interested in, is one of near-death experiences. And so, Ellen, I know that you have taught a lot of classes on the afterlife, but I would love for you to talk about how near-death experiences actually give us some insight on the afterlife. And are these experiences, are they comforting? Are they disconcerting to those individuals that have these experiences?
Yeah, great. I love talking about experiences. So we start my class each semester with a short unit on near-death experiences. That's really a critical thinking exercise for students about exactly the question of what do they show and what don't they show. And so there's a lot to that. The research on near-death experiences tends to cut across religions and cultures, and people fairly universally, although there are exceptions, absolutely. First of all, there's people who flatline and have no experience of anything. But for those who have a near-death experience, they tend to describe a positive experience of a loving presence and a sense of peace, as well as an emphasis on love and knowledge as what should be their goals in life. There are some fascinating, albeit few and far between, accounts of learning information during these experiences that they couldn't have known otherwise, developing psychic abilities, and being able to recount what was happening around them while they were technically dead. The research seems comforting to people. It is especially comforting to the people who have the near-death experiences, right? To a person, except again, for those very occasional negative experiences, they say that this experience is the best thing that happened to them and that they have a whole new understanding of life. And they tend to be comforting to others as well, just reading about them. In fact, my students are often comforted by them, and then I say, let's take a deeper look critically at what we can show from this and what we can't. But it is comforting, except for people whose religious views or scientific views see these as false delusions, right? And that can happen for sure when it does not conform to what one's tradition teaches or to one's scientific commitments. So I think in those cases, I think when I speak with healthcare professionals, I tend to stress that it's really important to recognize that for those who experience these NDEs are very real. These near-death experiences, abbreviated NDEs, are very real, not hallucinations, and that they should not be seen as people who need psychiatric care, should not be belittled or shamed, and that they should be listened to. I think the cultures have largely changed around that. For decades, it was the case that people would be sent to psychiatrists. They would be shamed. They felt like they couldn't talk about these. And that, thankfully, I think is shifting. When I think of this as a scholar, I think about it a little bit differently. While there's ongoing scientific research and academic debates on whether or not these are, quote, real glimpses of an afterlife or finding alternative explanations for what's happening, I tend to be less interested in that question. And I'm more interested in how these near-death experiences function in creating almost a new religion in its infancy, right? Like the people who have these experiences are forming communities online. They are talking about a particular type of spirituality. They're having spiritual conversion experiences and reaching out to new communities in ways that, as a scholar of religion, I find fascinating in seeing a kind of new religious tradition being born, while I, as a scholar, tend to bracket my questions about truth as I would for studying any other religion.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that. And this whole idea that a religion has even been formed around these experiences, that's fascinating to me. So yeah, I could go on, but I will just wrap up our time together. I do want to have space for people to do question and answer. And so if you do have a question, there's a function at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says raise hand. So I'm going to, if you have a question kind of formulated in your mind, I'm going to have all our panelists end on one question, and then we'll go to Q&A. So I would love for you each to reflect on how your interreligious learning and teaching, because I know you all are doing teaching in the classroom about death and dying, expanded your understanding about this shared universal experience. So we would love to just kind of hear how learning across different religious traditions have shaped your own learning, but also how you're experiencing the teaching moment with your students. Go ahead, Jamie. Oh, Richard, you can begin us.
Sure.
You're still on mute.
Thanks, sir. I think one of the beauties of the experience that I have been able to share with my colleagues, particularly through this seminar and through the readings that we've done together and the conversations work we've done, is the plurality of ways of looking, and that no tradition is monolithic in its understanding, and the way that together we each are have been able to see different facets that our own traditions may not necessarily emphasize. And so to be able to see this beautiful collage come together just gives a little bit more of a glimpse into that mystery of death that we're all speaking around and toward. And it has enabled me, I think, to be able to have a better and a deeper sense of how we together are working to a better care of one another and a better care of each other as communities on this earth.
Thank you, Richard. All right, go ahead, Jamie, and then Zainab, and then Ellen.
Yeah, it's very similar to what Richard has just named. I believe with every encounter is an opportunity for me to become again. And so in my teaching, with everyone bringing because I'm teaching seminarians and they are coming with their own unique lived experiences and perspectives. And we can say, sure, this is a class full of folks who identify as Christian, but if there are 18 of us and there are 18 different Christianities likely being practiced in that space, right? And so it has helped me see how big God, spirit is, right? How the little piece that I know is really small, right? And so I need other people's perspectives and lived experiences to even understand my own in some ways. So yeah, in the research and the teaching has taught me that whatever I do know, there is likely more. Whatever I have taught, there's likely the opportunity to go back and rethink what has been taught. Yeah, so it's big, and being open to allow yourself to hear spirit speak, even when it is something that you are not used to be open to consider that spirit might be speaking through someone else's experience that will help you in your death and rebirth in that moment.
Thank you, Dr. Jamie. I think for me, reflecting on death and dying interreligiously, on grief, and sharing this thinking with other people and hearing from them, I'm just seeing that there is, it facilitates such a deeper connection with other fellow human beings. And I'm thinking of, in our culture, we are so, in our quest for the pursuit of happiness, we celebrate the accolades, the birthdays, our job promotions, and, the retirement, the weddings, and all of that. But when we talk about the other half of the human experience that involves sadness and sorrow and loneliness and separation, there is so much opportunity for deeper growth and connection amongst humans. And I feel like we're just blocking that out. And we're not leaning into it enough. We are so afraid of being vulnerable. And when you bring that topic into the classroom and allowing everybody to come and explore it together interreligiously from a human perspective, that makes us connect more deeply. And I found that personally so reviving, and it's what I call and read about this lunar spirituality that allows us to grow together, deepen our connections in the challenging moments of our lives, and that it's not always happy and rosy and healthy. And so I think creating those spaces in the classroom, when I first offered the class on death and dying and 470 people registered, I thought, because there is a yearning, there is a desire for talking about these tough topics. And I wish we can find ways to do that more, and especially in the classroom with younger people who really have a deep desire to explore those existential questions. And what that then brings about is a new life. Like Jamie said, I love what you said about die before you die. Something in you dies as you're talking about death, but something also becomes alive which is so beautiful to witness as a scholar and as a human being.
Yeah, I can really mostly just echo what everyone has said. I mean, there's always more to learn, whether it's another culture and subculture or individual diversity within religious traditions and how this is understood. I think there is so much that it gives me to teach students and to allow that space. I know that Jamie didn't have a chance to talk about it today, but she also organizes death cafes, which is another great space for non-students to be opened up to have a place to talk about this. I do think that, I mean, it's really interesting because one thing that I learned is that people are afraid to talk about death, right? There are students that won't take my class. You couldn't pay them to take the class. And I think we need to change that, right? I think it's so important to think about death as this universal experience for how we think about life. It's important to even get people to open up so we can talk about the logistics of it so that people won't be afraid to talk about wills and DNRs and end of life care, right? Which are really important in our aging societies right now. I think for the students who want to take it, it's fantastic. I know I talked to Zainab the other day and I told her the story about how a student came to the class and said she came to Baldwin Wallace University because she saw that Death in the Afterlife was a course in the catalog, right? So that's how much she was hungering for a space to talk about this. And I see other students like that. Mine is a small regional college, but I have a colleague over at Stanford University that has started creating a seminar on death in the afterlife, and she teaches it way differently than I do, but it is really successful and students really want it. I think what I learned so much from my students, not only, like Jamie said, the lived experiences they bring to the class, but we end with them doing group projects on whatever they want to do related to death. And so some of them do things on sort of social violence and death in the ways that Jamie was talking about. Some of them do more deep dives into ritual, the way that Richard's talking about. Some of them talk about how death shows up in art or in music or in, mass popular culture. Some of them talk about what it means for them if they're going into the healthcare fields, and they talk about healthcare professionals or grief counseling or how we as societies treat suicide or green burials if they're interested in environment sustainability. I have learned so much from them. So I guess I just want to leave the professors out there with a call to teach a class on this topic and do it in the way that makes sense for you with your specializations and your interests, and you will not be disappointed.
Thank you all so much. I think you've given all of us some more information, more wisdom to think about and even bring back to whether it's our classrooms, the hospital settings, whatever organization we're working in. I appreciate you all so much for just the rich conversation. We do have one question that the audience is posing. Not everybody has to answer it, but if something leaps up and you said, oh, I have something I want to share, please do so. So this is the question. How should we confront our death, particularly at different stages of life, as we're young, as we're maturing, as we're aging, to embrace it, to be wary of it, to avoid it, prevent it as much as possible? So again, how should we confront our own deaths at different stages of life?
If I may, Alicia, just briefly, as a mom of a young daughter, I also share that with friends. I think having those conversations early in an age-appropriate way, gentle way, and trying to integrate those conversations into the family early on is very important preventive work. In terms of, a lot of the things that I shared about grief was grief support starts before tragedy hits. That means that you build those relationships of trust and love, have those conversations early. When I walk outside with my daughter in the park, I start a conversation about how death is part of the universe and that it's integrated it's a part of the natural cycle. and that it's not simply an odd occurrence. So even just walking in nature, having those conversations early is very important preventive work, attending funeral services, publicly visiting families, neighbors together with your children, those things that I try to do as a mother, as a scholar, and try to also share with my friends, is really important in preparing ourselves and our children and in accepting and embracing the reality of death. And I see it as preventive work. I can show up at my neighbor's door and ask about their, the sad news of their father's passing. If I don't have a relationship, it feels odd. So I think I see it as an imperative to build those healthy, strong relationships in our micro communities. So we are then able to be in each other's lives when tragedy hits and be supportive. So I think it just makes it more easier to have access into each other's lives.
Yes, in the Jewish tradition, we are called, the synagogue will sometimes literally call you and say, you need to go on a Shiva call, right? If someone has a relative who dies, you need 10 people present to say Kaddish, depending on how traditional. All Jews are different in how they practice, but in the more traditional ways, you would say that for 7 days, and you need people to show up. And I mean, I remember growing up, we would get phone calls on our landline in the house, and they'd say, "Come on over." But so yes, showing up and being there. But so how does that relate to the question, which is about how do I face my own death? And I think exactly, I mean, what Zainab's saying, that the more you can confront death, I would say that asking questions, asking yourself and reflecting regularly on what does the fact that I will die and that I don't know when mean for how I should be living my life now, whether it's a willingness to die in some ways to benefit others, which I think was an important and challenging call that Jamie gave us earlier. But what does it mean for me right now? And your answers may change as you go through different stages of life, and that's okay, right? But I think the important thing is to continually ask the question and to not be afraid of facing, what will it mean when I die? What will I want my legacy to be? What would I want people to say about me and who I was and how I lived? I think is an important question to be asking at every stage of life, even if your answers change.
And can I add just very, very quickly, and not waiting to feel okay about the conversation, right? So what does it mean to be sort of to grow some comfort in the discomfort that comes with it? Because sometimes we want to wait until we feel like, oh, at some point I'll feel better about having the conversation. No, it is okay to be uncomfortable, be angry, but that is also space for conversation. And lastly, I think using pop culture is a great way to allow yourself to engage conversation and confront death and things like that. I use This Is Us, which, I mean, folks may not have seen it, but I used a show that was popular to engage folks who would never really talk about death and dying, right? Because they got to look at someone else's life on the screen and to explore it. And then you can throw in a reflective question for self. So that can also be helpful.
Thank you so much for your answers. I know we are right at time. Dr. Taya, is there a way, I see that we still have some questions. Is there a way if a person has a question, we can get it back to the panelist?
Yes.
Okay, because Cletus, I do see that your hand is up and I want to acknowledge you. If you don't mind sending your question to Dr. Taya, and we can send it to the panelists so they can respond to you. Is that okay? All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Friends, this has been such a rich conversation, and I know for myself, I have received so much from you all sharing not only your wisdom and your knowledge, but your heart. This is, again, something that we all have to face. And so, as I heard you all say time and time again, let's face it in community. Let's be there for one another. And so I just want to again thank you, Oxford Interfaith Forum, for partnering with ICJS on this wonderful session to kick off the World Interfaith Week. And so we hope that you join us for some other sessions. I believe the next one is February 3rd. And again, we thank you and we hope to see you again. Have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Tia. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, my
Yes.
colleagues and everybody here.
Thank
Yes,
you all.
thank you all so much.
Thank you. That was very meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you
And look
all
forward
for
to
your
more
thoughts.
sessions, what we can do together.
Yes.